Alright, hello everybody. I have a very special video for today because you will know his name. He is Brandon Sanderson, author of surely one of your favourite books, given that you follow this channel. Thank you very much for coming on the channel today to talk about your work.
My pleasure, thanks for having me.
So you have a book coming out, which is the latest one in the Stormlight Archives, and I've got the first book, well, the first two books of the one book, The Way of Kings here. Would you like to talk a little bit about that book that's coming out, The Rhythm of War?
Sure. I mean, it's tough to talk about book 4 in a series, right? Because you don't want to give too many spoilers. No one's going to pick up book 4 without having read the earlier books in the series. So most people, it's kind of this weird thing where we're doing publicity for it, but most people already know if they're going to buy this book or not, right? Like, and those who haven't heard of it, they're not going to buy it. They're hopefully going to go buy The Way of Kings. It's been an interesting process, though, because I haven't done a lot of fourth books. If you look at my career, I've done trilogies, a number of trilogies, but Stormlight is my first big, more than 3-book epic that I'm doing, other than I did some middle grade books that did go to a fourth book, but those reach 50,000 words. So together, those are shorter than a Stormlight book. And so really, it's interesting to me that the Stormlight series just has a really weird structure, right? And so it didn't even occur to me that it was the fourth book, because the Stormlight Archive, I generally plot each book as a trilogy. So in a lot of ways, this book was doing, books in my head, 13, 14, and 15 or something like that. I guess it's not quite there. My numbers are off. It's doing 10, 11, and 12 of the series. But I don't even view it that way, right? Because it's just a weird structure. But it is an interesting book for other reasons. As you write a series, even if you're an outliner like me, things change, right? For those who have followed the series, like I did a whole bunch more with Esh and I earlier in the series than I was planning. And this book was the one that was going to dig into the singer culture and things like that. But I've already done a bunch of that. So that required tweaks to the flashback sequence, which was going to be Esh and I split between Esh and I and Venley, just so that I could have more variety in there, because the big showpiece, what their culture was like, had already been shown off in a previous book. So it's an interesting book for a lot of different reasons, but it's also, most of them are spoilerific, right? But it's also interesting in that it is leading to the finale of this sequence, right? The first 5 books are a sequence. And so the end of this book, by the time you reach it, you should know where everybody is placed for the climactic book. It should indicate to you what exactly is going to be in that climactic book of this sequence. And so it was also interesting from that aspect. There's a lot of cool things about it, but I can't really talk about a lot of the details.
No, and that's totally fair. So we won't go into that. But I find it really interesting that you mentioned that you kind of plan these books as a trilogy. Is that because you sort of view each character's kind of story as a book in itself?
Actually, no. That's a good guess. But it is because basically to write anything, the process for me is to break it down into smaller parts, right? How do you write a 450,000 word book? Well, you ask yourself, what are the smaller pieces that make that 450,000 word book? And one of the things I did not want to have happen when people are reading these books, I love big epics. I love The Wheel of Time, for example. And yet, having read a lot of really cool big epics, I know what some of the pitfalls are. And there's this danger of certain books in a big series of epics feeling like the book where nothing happens, right? It's like the connective tissue between other books. This happens sometimes. And I wanted to avoid that. So I wanted each book to have lots of rising and falling action, lots of powerful scenes. You don't want the only thing that's interesting about the book to happen in the last chapters. And I do like these big explosive climaxes, right? But my worry would be that you would have boring book with a splash of excitement at the end. And I've read books like that before, usually sandwiched in the middle of a big series where the author is juggling so many things that you end up with setup, and then a splash of action at the end. And so one of the ways to avoid that was to say, well, what if I paste these each so that you have a mini climax, and then a big climax, right? And you can kind of piece that together. It's very, very weird because in the UK, your editions are split into 2, when really I'm viewing them as 3 books. And so that all gets pretty wonky. Usually they will cut at one of the climaxes. So you'll get like 2 of the books and then 1 by itself, but not always. Sometimes they just cut right in the middle. But it's more about how I envision making sure that things are happening. And that we are learning things. And so to not give spoilers for this one, for instance, in Oathbringer, mild spoiler for that, the whole intro sequence with exploring Urithiru and opposite Kaladin back in Alethkar, this is all the first book, ending kind of both with a punch at the end of those 2 sequences. And it's like 110,000 words. It's the length of a regular novel. It is just set up in some ways, but at least comes to a big kind of dramatic. So there's pieces and you're seeing things come together and there's excitement and motion rather than just all set up. And that's just to help me make these books be interesting. I want them to read like books that are much shorter than they are. And the way I do that is to make sure that there's climaxes there.
That's a really good way to think of it. So you're not just kind of thinking, I want people to have a satisfying ending. I want people to have a satisfying journey. I want to be building up and then kind of going down and building up again and then building up to a big thing at the end. Because I remember like my experience at the end of The Way of Kings. I was like, there's something here that he's leading up to. I just don't know what it is. And then like in your last like final, I don't know, must have been like 5 pages or something when the king sits down with and you realize what all these quotes at the beginning of the chapters were. It was really clever because I really appreciated that sort of sudden turnaround.
For books this length, you need multiple different things that are working. You're talking about like the epigraphs coming together at the end. That's another thing I like to do, which just is another way to get some motion and working on a different axis in the books and making sure, like I do this in Oathbringer 2, where are these quotes from, who wrote them, that sort of thing. It's a lot of fun to me to just add, the thing that I think makes books interesting, makes stories interesting, is watching that progress. It really is about the journey. The journey's got to be exciting, and that's watching pieces build upon one another so that they slowly interlock, and that experience of watching them slowly interlock is got to be as interesting as the final explosion. Maybe not as action-packed, but it's got to hold your attention. In some of my favorite books, this is what makes them work. This is why I thought, The Martian was so powerful in getting people really excited by it, is that all these little pieces, all these little climaxes, all this little progress, it's all so interesting and fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, so you've been talking a bit about structure here, and I've got a question, which is that, often when people sit down to write a book, they think, I have to use the 3-act structure or whatever. Have you ever utilized non-standard plot structures, or how does conventional plot structure fit into how you think about your work going into it?
Yeah, it's a very astute question. I generally don't focus too much on 3-act structure. I do keep it in mind because it is a good tool. It is an excellent tool, particularly when, for instance, I'm building a book that is 3 different books. Knowing why the different acts of a 3-act structure are handy and what they do is very helpful. But I generally am not focusing too much on it because 3-act structure, if it's a tool that works for you, great, helps you tell stories. But a lot of the traditional Hollywood 3-act structure is centered around this idea of the short piece of fiction, right? They have only a certain number of pages to tell their story, and those pages in a manuscript format for screenplay format just zip past. You only have a couple hundred words on every page, if that much. And so it's got to be really rigid because you have this external limit on your length, right? You can't play a movie past a certain length because the theaters just won't show it, because they need to be able to fit a certain number of screenings in a day. We don't have that requirement in fiction. You are allowed to tell the story the length within reason that works for the story you're telling. And so while 3-act format can still be handy, I focus instead on this idea of what do I want to have happen at the end? I usually plot my books backward. What is the of the various different subplots coming together? Where am I trying to go? What sort of experience am I trying to construct? And then I work backward and say, all right, what is the exciting way to get there? What's the progress that's going to be as fascinating as that climax? What are the twists and turns in that progress? And I'm just making bullet points, right? And there will be some natural ups and downs. And I do generally plot these, for the Stormlight at least, with saying, all right, I want to make sure that the first chunk comes to its own climax, and the next chunk, whose story fits in there, where they have a natural progress, beginning, middle, and end that I can hit with an ending, and that sort of thing. But really, it's this idea of powerful ending with the pieces that are going to lead to it. And if you look at my outlines, it's not going to say Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. It might say Part 1, which is just me splitting off to a mini climax and things like that. But there might be 5 parts. Stormlight books do have 5 parts. Even though I view them as like 3 books, they've got 5 parts. It's very, very, very weird. But really, if you look at my outline, it would say, I want to have this great moment. I want to have this powerful moment that's at the end of the Way of Kings, where there's that interaction between Dalinar and Kaladin that I won't spoil specifics, but I want to earn that. How do I earn that? What are the pieces along the way? What are the scenes that are going to make that chapter really sing when you get to it? And those are more important than the ending. And so my outline will have the bullet points outlining all these different steps along the way. And what's going to make them interesting? What's going to make you want to read that step?
That's actually really like validating for me, because not knowing this, that's how I plan my stories. I go, okay, there's an ending I want, and I work backwards from there. So it's really interesting that you don't keep that sort of stuff in mind, like as a kind of rigid structure. Would you say that like thinking about these sort of standard plot structures and scene structures is more helpful as like a critique mechanism for your own work, like looking at, what might be missing here that I didn't think of before? Is that like how you might use them? That's
exactly how I do it. If something is broken, a lot of the things I talk about in my class, which we did film for YouTube this year, so people can watch that. A lot of the things I talk about in that are things that I either spend time working in the planning stage or in the diagnosis of problem stage. One I talk about a lot is promises and making sure the reader is able to anticipate what this plot line is going to do. And one that commonly I use these days as an example happened in Oathbringer. And this will be mild spoilers, but not major ones. I'll talk around the major spoilers. But we've got a sequence in Oathbringer where some characters are traveling through Shadesmar, which is the kind of the alternate dimension, right? The cognitive realm. And it's a fantastical and interesting place, and it's the first time we've gone there for any length of time. And I wrote this whole sequence, thought it was great, was really excited by it, and I gave it to beta readers when they read the whole book, and a lot of them were saying, I'm not really into this sequence. So I'm a little bored. And I was like, what? I've been building to this for multiple books. This is supposed to be really fascinating world building stuff. This is what my books are about.
This is what I've been wanting.
Yeah. Why are people not getting engaged by this sequence? And I then had to kind of apply some of these tools, right? Like, what is the structure of the sequence? Why is it not working? And what I found is, in the original draft of this sequence, right at the beginning, all the characters are like, we need to get to this place. There's this place in the world where you can get out of Shadesmar. And they all talk about, all right, we need to get there. But I, as a writer, knew they actually need to end up in a different place where the climax of the book was going to be happening. And so as a writer, I'm like, yeah, we'll just divert them from that and send them down here to this other place, and then it'll be great. What was happening in readers' minds was that I had promised them we're going from point A to point B, but I ended up taking the point C, and in their heads, point C was a diversion. That all of this going that wrong direction was taking them out of the way, and I was eventually going to drive them back to point B. And you'll see this this happens in movies sometimes where you're like bored by a sequence because your brain has figured out this is filler until we get back to the main story. And you just get bored by it, even though exciting things are happening. And I realized this was all about promises. I needed upfront to let the reader know, no, going to point B is wrong, they need to go to point C. And I did this by having, moving some things around so that one of the main characters there has basically a premonition given to him that says, no, you need to get to point C. You need to get there. That's really important. So the reader was signaled, this is the actual plot. And the people wanting to go to point B are wrong. So when we get veered off toward point C, you're like, oh, good, we're on target. And then with the gamma readers, everyone loved this sequence. It worked exactly like I wanted it to. But it's this really great lesson in diagnosing. Sometimes you can write the most exciting things, but if the reader isn't on board for it, if they don't feel like it's making progress toward the things you promised them would happen in the story, you can just lose them completely. Even no matter how great an author you think you are, you will make these mistakes. And it's just sometimes about reassessing how to indicate to the reader what's going to happen, which is really tricky, right? Because you don't want everything to be obvious. You do want there to be twists and turns and unexpected things happening in all the stories. You do want to have obstacles that characters are overcoming. You want drama. And so it is a balancing act where you don't want to necessarily signpost everything, but in that specific case, I realized I needed to better signpost that sequence.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's part of the reason that, we're not always great at critiquing our own work is that it's so hard to separate like what we know the story, where we know the story is going, and what feeling the reader actually has in its direction.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you are kind of like piecing together a story, Stormlight Archives is one of your more slowly paced series,
yes,
compared to like Skyward, which is relatively fast-paced, Mistborn, which is moderately paced. Why does Stormlight Archives have a slower pace, slower burn? A lot more, whether Skyward is fast-paced. Where does pacing come into you for that?
Good question. So pacing shapes the reader experience in a lot of ways, and it also there's a couple of reasons why I pace things differently. So with a shorter book, a person can conceivably sit down and read it in one sitting or a couple of sittings. And I find that there are tools you can use that, if you're going to experience a book in one or two sittings, can just rip you through that book and pull you and make that sort of page-turner philosophy. But I have found that if you keep that going too long, the reader actually gets tired, gets exhausted by the book, and you start to lose the reader. Because when you're keeping people at one or two emotions for the course of a story, then that starts to get old. And there's a certain length you can do a story, even something like Skyward, you need downturns and upturns, right? You can't be at a 10 the whole time. A shorter story, sometimes thrillers will keep it at 10 for the entire story, and that can work as long as it's the right length, and the mysteries and things you're discovering are of the right length. Stormlight Archive is different. I expect people to be putting Stormlight down and reading it across multiple days. That experience, knowing that that's going to be partially their experience, I want to shape where the places you can put the book down are so that you will have like this satisfied feeling. That you're like, I got a big chunk. This is something I need time to process. And I can put things in those books, therefore, that require more time to process, right? And I can expect you to keep track of multiple characters and storylines and things like this. And so it lets me shape a different type of story. And I feel like as a writer, this slow burn also lets me pull off climaxes, which are in many ways more dramatic and more powerful. It's like with Skyward, I get to move between a band of like 7 and 10, where with Stormlight, I get to move between a band of like 1 and 20, right? Of the different emotions that I can really make work in that book. And so there's trade-offs, right? Because Stormlight books have these lulls, there is the chance that people are going to put it down and not pick it back up. The bigger danger is that they will get lost in the beginning because there is so much world building, and because I'm starting lower and building higher. If people put the Stormlight Archive down, generally it's in the first part of the first book. They just realize this is not the experience I was looking for. And that's a built-in both advantage and disadvantage of writing books at this length, at least the way that I write them. The advantage is when you get into a book like the Stormlight Archive, there is a lot to get into, right? There is so much there for you. I use the term fractal world building. A fractal is something that gets more complex the closer you look at it, right? And I like my world building in something like the Stormlight Archive to deserve your attention. I like you to be able to look at the small pieces of the world building and find more there to love. That's not going to happen as much in something like Skyward. There's just not the time to put all of that in. I've got to have a focused, narrow experience, which is great. It's like having a really good burger versus a large 3-course meal. And there are times where I just want a burger. And that's what Skyward is for. It's what these fast-paced, it's the difference between getting a really good movie and a really good long-form series, right? They just do different things, and we like different things. And so that pacing is intentional in Stormlight. But it also is its greatest drawback, right? The greatest drawback of Stormlight is that it's hard to get into. The greatest strength is once you get into it, you are much more likely to stick with it and really get into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hear from a lot of people, like in my audience, you know, they say that they love Mistborn and they love like the magic system, but when people talk about like the richness of the characters and they talk about kind of how emotionally invested they are in the story, they talk about Stormlight. That's they talk about Kaladin's depression, they talk about I won't give any spoilers for Oathbringer, but Dalinar's arc and that. And when tension fatigue, you really manage that really well. But I think part of the reason that, this slower pacing is in the Stormlight Archives is you do a lot of foreshadowing. There's a lot of foreshadowing done throughout the series. And linking that to what you said with the Shadesmar stuff that like people didn't expect it, how do you foreshadow kind of big changes in the story that you want to hold back but not mislead or not set them up for the expectation that it's coming but not give it away? How do you try to manage that?
Boy, there's a whole lot involved here, and it is really tricky. It's one of the reasons why when I tried to write the Stormlight Archive the first time, when I wrote The Way of Kings in 2002, the version we released as Way of Kings Prime, it's one of the reasons that book failed.
2002?
Yeah, 2002. And one of the reasons that book failed, the reason I didn't release that book is that this whole foreshadowing thing was not working right. There was just, I'd never tried something on this scope before. And so there's a lot of little things that go in to make this all work. One of which is you often, as a writer, work like a stage magician. You have the reader's attention focused on this thing, which is dramatic and impactful and happening right now. In the first book, Shallan is stealing the Soulcaster, right? That is her plot. That's the thing you're paying attention to. Meanwhile, over here, you are laying the groundwork for the evolution of that story. So you want this one to... you resolve it in a way that is satisfying but unexpected. There's aspects to it you're not getting, and the way that it's satisfying, even when it's not expected, you're like, this is when you bring in this hand, right? This hand saying, no, this thing that's much bigger that we've been foreshadowing in a small way now is coming to play, and you realize you don't really want this. You want this. You want this climax. And this is subsumed by this one, right? And so while this is exciting and interesting and the kind of day-to-day plot is happening with this smaller scale thing, you are building this larger scale thing. And so I often say there are a lot of ways to do a surprise in a book. One of the ways, you can imagine it like Christmas presents. You promise someone a car and you give them, you promise your kid a toy car and you give them a toy car. That is... totally, you can make that satisfying. This is how Jane Austen books work, right? When I read a Jane Austen book, she's like, I'm going to promise you a romance between two characters you're going to come to love. And that's what I want. And then I get that in the book. And there's nothing wrong with writing a story like that. They are enormously satisfying, and if you do that really well. But there's another way where it's like, you promise the reader a car, and you show them the toy car, but in the background, you're showing them a toy jet. And they're starting to realize, man, I really like that toy jet. I really wish I could have that instead, but I'm promised the car. And then you do the switcheroo by the end where you're like, surprise, you're getting the jet. And if you've laid your groundwork well, that's what they've realized they wanted all along, right? That's what's happening with the Shallan plot line in book 1, is I'm giving you something different at the end than I promised you, but it is something you realize that you want more. There's also you're going to get a toy car, and here's an RC car. You get what you wanted, but it's even better, right? It's got these other aspects, and there's just lots of different ways to do a surprise that is different from the. There is the way I usually use Into the Woods as an example of this. If you're not familiar with it, it's a play by Sondheim that halfway through changes to a completely different type of story. And that's like, here's a toy car, instead I'm gonna kick you. And it takes a special kind of storyteller to pull that off. It is totally possible. And when it works, it is what makes the piece work, right? Into the Wood works because instead of a toy car, you get kicked in the face. But there's a certain type of person, like my mom hates that story, right? Because she was promised a car, she doesn't want to kick in the face. So you have to find the people who secretly want to kick in the face and didn't know it to pull that off, and it's really dangerous, but it also is another way you can do these stories. And there's just so many different ways you can evolve a twist or a turn in the plot, and all of them rely on your ability to foreshadow what's actually going to happen and have the reader's wants and needs working sometimes hand in hand and sometimes against each other, really the characters' wants and needs. And it's one of these things that takes a long time of practice to learn. And it's one of those things that I was much worse at, particularly during my unpublished years. As more of these unpublished books come out, you'll see that I was much worse at balancing these two things. That's what makes Aether of Night, one of my early unpublished works, not work, is like the two halves never gel, and I'm never able to make you say, this one is what I wanted all along. You just want this one because I do a much better job of showing off this one, for instance. And that's a story where it's like, it's almost a Shakespearean role reversal comedy couched in a giant epic fantasy that's trying to launch the Cosmere. And the giant epic fantasy trying to launch the Cosmere just kind of face plants. And the smaller story about a brother with mistaken identity actually just works. And so that book is, some of the readers have read that. I let one of the fan sites give that out to people. If you want to read a copy of it, you can get it on 17th Shard. I let them just give that one. But that's why that one kind of face plants, is those two halves never quite work together. And so it's a lot of practice. This is what those 13 books that I wrote before I got published were teaching me. One of those things was this.
That's really insightful, and it's so great to kind of hear, that you guys do think about this sort of thing, that you do kind of think about this when you're going about it. Like the Cosmere though, like the Cosmere is kind of this thing that is in all of your books, but it's not like there. It's not in the front of it. It's not in the face of it.
It's the secret epic.
Yeah, it's the secret epic. And, like, you've got a series coming out, which is a Dragon Knight. Sorry, I can't remember. Something to do with the dragon, about, like...
Oh, Dragon Steel, yeah. Yep.
Yes, that's right. I'm
Long way away from releasing that one, but that's Hoyd's backstory. Wit's backstory, if you read the Stormlight Archives. So, yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel that, like, once the entire story of the Cosmere is out, like, are you just going to keep adding to it? Or, like, keep adding more worlds, more stories to it? Or are you going to, like, move on to something else, do you think? I doubt I would move on to something else. I would probably do more stories in the middle. But remember, the end of the Stormlight Archive, or the end of the Cosmere, it requires all 10 books of the Stormlight Archive to be out first. And Era 2 and Era 3 of Mistborn to be finished. And 2 more books in the Elantris series before I can do that. So we've got a ways until I can do that. We're talking a life's work here.
Yeah, my goal is to get this all done by the time I turn 70. And I've only got 25 years left to do that, which sounds like a long time until you count the books that I need to do. So I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about making sure I get it done before I die. That's what I'm worried about. And so that's why I'm kind of keeping my focus on things. The Cosmere is my secret epic. For those who don't know, it's there's lots of different places I can point to it starting. But one of the reasons it started is during those early years when I was writing those books that were unpublished, I really wanted to do an epic series, a very big epic series, and I wasn't sure if publishing would ever let me do it. I was trying to break in during the era right after Wheel of Time and Sword of Truth and Game of Thrones had gotten big, and publishers had started to hunt for epic fantasy, and then had released a couple that had failed spectacularly. And the publishers were thinking that the market was saturated with epic fantasy. And this is the time where things like Harry Potter really exploded in Twilight, where the industry was feeling epic fantasy is saturated, and what people want is something different from that. I often say they were all hunting for Joe Abercrombie without knowing it. They wanted gritty, short, faster paced things that were kind of in the vein of George Martin, but maybe not as thick as George Martin. And they were right, like Joe's a great writer, but that was the sort of thing. They were looking for the Joe Abercrombies of the world. And I was releasing and trying to publish in this when people were saying, don't send us book 1 of 10, send us a tight standalone. That's what we want. And I'm like, well, I can do that. It's where Elantris came from. I'm going to write a standalone. It's still going to be big because I like epic stuff. But if I want to tell my epic, I'm going to have to hide it from the publishers. I'm going to have to start putting these things in that are tying all these books together. And I'm going to have to pull one of these things where, I'm not the one who invented it, right? Stephen King had been doing this for years at that point, where he was connecting his stories together through The Dark Tower and other things. But I realized I'm going to have to do something like this if I want to have this big epic. And so I started embedding Hoyd and things about the Cosmere and stuff like that into these stories I was writing that were all standalone books with series potential. That's what they were all telling me they wanted. So when you read things like, we'll eventually release Mistborn Prime and Final Empire Prime, and White Sand's another example of this, which are these early books that are unpublished that were me trying to write standalones with series potential. The only one that was actually of publishable quality was Elantris, and that was only after an editor got a hold of it. The other ones could probably have gotten there with enough editing, but the fact that Elantris worked with the editing let me just launch into Mistborn, where they were willing to give me a trilogy to kind of prove myself on. So,
yeah. And of course, Mistborn is I don't know if it's your most well-known work, but it's probably the one that I hear the most about in kind of broader audiences.
Yeah, it's generally the best place to start, right? Because it is complete,
right?
And the first book, even that first book is written kind of as a standalone, right? It's a standalone with 2 sequels that build into an epic, but the first book is meant to be snappy. That's different from Stormlight, right? Stormlight 1, it does come to a climax. It has an ending, but it is clearly not the end of the story. Where Mistborn could be the end. You could tweak it and not have the stinger at the end that indicates where a sequel will go, and it could just be one book by itself.
Yeah, and it's also very accessible. I find it interesting, you're talking about how you entered the industry, because there's kind of a poetic nature to this, where you went into an industry that was demanding a type of book that you weren't necessarily interested in, and obviously now, like, you have influenced so many people trying to get into the industry now with, I mean, I would say that a huge part of that is your influence on hard magic systems being kind of popularizing them, not creating them. Of course.
Definitely not.
Things been around since the Wheel of Time.
And Pat did some work on that too. Pat Rothfuss, right? Because he's got the nice. Yeah. I often point out how one of the things I love so much about Name of the Wind is that it's got both a hard and a soft magic system playing off each other. But Tolkien did the same thing, right? The One Ring's a hard magic, Gandalf's a soft magic. He plays them against each other beautifully in those books. So yeah, but definitely. So when I got published, I'm kind of a reaction against the grimdark, right? Not that I dislike the grimdark. I love some of those writers. I'm glad that the industry has all of this, but I couldn't, I think, have broken out until grimdark had started, and they needed a response to it, because grimdark was a response to the quest fantasy of the 80s and early 90s, right? And all media is a dialogue where different things are responding to each other. And so fantasy had this thing where it's got the quest fantasy, your David Eddings and your Terry Brooks classic quest, and then it moved into kind of this evolution of the quest fantasy, which you call the Robert Jordans and things like that, and then that kind of turned into grimdark, right? George Martin kind of kicking off this movement of let's go low magic, grittier, looking at anti-heroes and shades of gray. And then I could launch with high magic again, right? Where it's like, no, we're going to go very fantastical, lots of magic, lots of people using the magic, and it still has this sort of shades of gray, but there were like two sides of the coin, right? George is shades of gray with pessimism coding it, right? Which is actually good, right? Like some of my favorite stories are pessimistic in nature because the warning, the way that sci-fi and fantasy can warn, like 1984 is an inherently pessimistic book, but it makes us optimistic in many ways, right? Because we see this. I think great fiction should, but there's also the other side of the coin, right? The optimistic side, the Star Trek side, where it's like, we can look to the future, and instead of it being a smoldering wreck that we've destroyed, we've actually worked out our differences and gotten out into the galaxy. So my work, I would say, takes the optimistic perspective, right? This idea that, there's a lot of different shades of gray in people's personalities, but people tend to be good, and we can find that goodness in other people and build upon it. And that's kind of a fundamental of just how I view storytelling and writing. And I don't know that would have taken off as big if there hadn't been a very big pessimistic side looking fantasy series for me to react against. And now we're probably going to see people reacting against me in different ways. I mean, you could argue that the rise of kind of literary fantasy as a thing like N.K. Jemisin, like literary fantasy did not sell for a long time, but now it's doing really well. And that might be because, as a response against me and George writing kind of the more plot-driven, you would call it. I mean, everything's character-driven, but more of the kind of classic structures. Then you get Nora, who's writing second-person bizarre stuff that still works as maybe a response against that.
Yeah, I actually really like that kind of framing that it's fantasy shaded with optimism, and I think part of that comes out in the sense that, forgive me if I'm wrong, but you tend to write positive arcs for your characters. Is that your characters tend to change for the better. They grow and come out of darkness rather than descending into it, even if they've very often come from quite dark places. Is that an intentional kind of framing thing for you?
You will find the occasional one that goes the other direction for contrast. You need that in a story. But in my experience, have found that in general, the people I know are trying to be better people. And are working toward it, and it can be hard, and you slip sometimes. But that's my experience. That's real life to me. Is that people are trying to be better, and we may not get along because we may have different opinions on things, but we can figure out how to get along. And there's going to be mistakes, but that's kind of what I want to write. And I built the framework in the Stormlight Archive so that the magic system and the plots both align to the characters' journeys. Quite intentionally. There's a reason why the Oaths work the way they do, is because I wanted the characters' journeys. The Stormlight Archive is about the first 5 books is these 5 characters and their journeys to try to be better people, basically, right? And figuring out how to do that in different ways, and what being a better person is very different for Shallan than for Kaladin. But that's the journey of this series, is their attempts, and the magic kind of aligns to that rather than the other way around.
Yeah, and I do think that you really beautifully merge that magic system and those arcs together, which is really, really well done. Like I really noticed that when I was reading it. What would you say, bringing all this together? Is there something that you want your legacy to be in the fantasy genre, or the fantasy and sci-fi genre? Because you are technically a sci-fi writer.
Yeah. I don't think a lot about that. Every author thinks about it a little bit, I'm sure. My primary goal is to tell the stories the best way I can, right? I'm less worried about how am I influenced in the genre, what is my legacy, than the fact that I want people right now to pick up these books, and if they're having a hard time in their lives, that the books make their lives better. That it, not just through escapism, but also through showing characters and the journeys they have, and maybe that helping us all. Like, when I write these books, I'm exploring the world and trying to understand the world better, and trying to make the world a better place through understanding, right? That's the thing. Like when I write Jasna, it's like I want to understand people. I'm a person who's a theist. I have a lot of faith in my life. I want to write about somebody who is a good person who is very different from me, and I want to understand them, right? Like that's one of my mandates for myself as a writer. And I want people to pick up these books and say, this journey was worth it. Brandon did not let me down. Brandon did what he promised. There were surprises, but he did not let me down. That's all I'm worried about. I want this story to be a good story. If I had aspirations, if you're like, what would you love to be in the future? How would you like to be remembered? Probably the person that I would pick would be Stan Lee. Right? This is a person who's created a lot of stories and a lot of characters that a lot of people love and has made a lot of people's lives better because of it, and is remembered fondly for that, right? If I could be Stan Lee, that would be wonderful, right? If in 100 years people are talking of me like people talk about Stan right now, great. The most positive aspects of his career. Let's highlight that because there were some things where Stan Lee maybe not sharing credit where he should have shared credit, and there are definitely things there to talk about. But you know what I mean when I'm talking about that. And that's not necessarily the type of story he told, but the way he's regarded. I would love to in the future there have been adaptations of my work that have inspired other artists, like his work inspired a lot of different people, and things like that. So, but I don't think about it a ton. I think about, let's make this story the best story it can be. I often, during the early days, when people would ask me, are you worried that you're going to get overshadowed by the Wheel of Time while you're working on it? I'm like, no, I'm a storyteller. I'm an entertainer. I want to make people's lives better. And if the people who read the Wheel of Time books enjoyed and I was able to do this thing and that becomes my legacy, is that I'm a footnote to that, I don't care. That's great. That's what I want to do. So I don't focus too much on that, I guess. Despite talking about it now for like 5 minutes straight.
No, I think that is the highest thing that, we can hope for in our books, is that, they're exercises in empathy. They're things that help people connect with, others and themselves. And by the way, you mentioned that, like your theism is reflected in kind of your works. And I think it's really beautifully woven into the stories that you've written. Like there's a subtlety to it and a nuance to it that I really appreciate in the writing. And I think it's great that you're able to bring that sort of stuff into your book.
Well, thank you. It's important to me that I'm trying to explore the human experience in as many directions as possible. But I also, I like having that spectrum, right? We've got Jasna, who is an atheist. We've got Kaladin, who's a traditional agnostic, right? It's like, I don't really care. And I don't know. And that's not relevant to me. And then you kind of move into Dalinar, who's a revolutionary, reformist, so to speak. And then someone like Navani, who's more conservative in religious beliefs. And I like having people all along the spectrum and dealing with it because it's a part of so many people's lives and so much of the human experience during the history of human experience that it's just really fun for me to play with the different ways that we all interact with the divine.
Yeah, and it's that spectrum that really comes out. We've only got time for for one more question, okay. Basically. Now, I asked my people, what questions would you want me to ask? And everyone wanted me to ask you specific world-building questions. So I've only chosen one. Yes. Because they're very specific questions about the world building, which I love. That the people, I spent so much time as a Wheel of Time fan theorizing about the Wheel of Time's magic and things, and so I fully welcome this, but it is hard to get all those answers, all those questions answered. So I'm glad you've narrowed it down to one. Yeah. I wanted to kind of focus more on your process because I think you've probably been nailed with those questions a million times. The question is, why crustaceans?
Why crustaceans? Okay. So couple of reasons. I did see a meme.
Oh, do you want to tell, for people that haven't read it?
Yeah.
You've got crustaceans in the Stormlight Archive.
Yes.
Big creatures.
Big crustacean creatures. Lots of, so there's a couple reasons here. I'll say that I saw a meme the other day that cracked me up. I don't know, it was on Reddit or something, where someone showed like traditional fantasy creatures that everyone does, and they showed a picture of me going, one of those memes. And then it's like a crab, and I'm like, why crustaceans? Couple of reasons. When I was working on Roshar, I tried to build the ecology as naturally as I could from the idea of the high storms. And one of the places I went to that had a gradient of extremes of different types of biomes impacting it was the tidal pools, right? Where tidal pools would have to be able to survive dried out or mostly dried out. They'd have to deal with the impact of the waves, which is actually pretty dramatic when you're a small little creature. And then also the stagnance of just after the waves have retreated, right? Like there's 3 different big sort of different biomes, the wrong term, different types of weather or whatnot, different extremes of experience that things in tidal pools have to deal with. And so I looked to tidal pools as kind of a bit of an inspiration for how a world would respond to high storms. It's not the only place I went. Obviously, there isn't grass in tidal pools and things like that. But with some of the creatures, I'm like, exoskeletons make a whole lot of sense when the world is this violent and tempestuous. And things that can live both in water and out of water make a lot of sense for the way that I'm doing the high storms. And so I looked to crustaceans as my exemplar, and I kind of started building from there. And it felt very natural to me. That, of course, caused other things, right? To get around the square cube law, I started with a high oxygen, low gravity environment. Roshar's like 70% Earth gravity. That wasn't enough, and so I had to build in the spren bonds and things like that could actually get me the big beasties I wanted. But the rule of cool answer is I wanted big, interesting monsters that did not look like things you saw in other fantasy books, right? When I was building Chasm Fiends, I'm like, what can I do that's gonna look that it has a feel for this series? That is interesting, that still evokes some of those cool feelings that I got from reading fantasy books, but takes it a different direction. And so that's where I went. So there's kind of the reason, the Sanderson zeroth law, err on the side of what's awesome. And there's also the just kind of natural outgrowth of me trying to world build something that felt like it fit with the weather patterns I was creating.
Absolutely, and it totally fits with this world which is constantly being attacked by high storms, just swamped with water. All right, well, I want to say thank you so much for coming on the channel. It's been awesome. Would you like to just say when Rhythm of War comes out, where to get it, that sort of stuff?
So Rhythm of War comes out on the 17th of November. You can find it in all of your favorite locations. It should be in all bookstores and online in all major ebook retailers. And the audiobook is launching simultaneously. I do think that the UK is launching the same day, even though the UK and World English, as we put them, so Australia and Ireland and New Zealand, they do tend to launch on Thursdays a lot of times, but with my books, I think they tend to launch them on the same day as the US launch, just so that people don't feel bad having to wait 2 extra days to get their books. 17th of November.
All right, well, that's where you guys can get it, and I'll try to leave some links down below. Thank you very much, Brandon. It's been an absolute honor talking to you, and I'm very much looking forward to reading Rhythm of War when it comes out.
Awesome. Thank you very much.